All right, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Monday, June 2nd, and we had a pretty interesting weekend. Of course, I'm talking about this drone attack that Ukraine carried out, and some people are calling it Russia's Pearl Harbor. What do you think of that statement?
Well, that seems a little bit excessive. Of course, the Ukrainians, Zelensky claims that 41 bombers were destroyed. That seems to be a great exaggeration. Perhaps a dozen, perhaps half a dozen. It's not completely clear at this point. I think at least a half a dozen yeah, have been confirmed. Half a dozen destroyed bombers have been confirmed. We're talking about largely strategic bombers. Bombers that would can carry nuclear bombs, nuclear missiles. So this is actually quite a serious incident. Even if it wasn't 41, even if it's only half a dozen, this is part of, uh, these bombers are part of Russia's nuclear deterrence. And according to Russia's nuclear doctrine, that such an attack that degrades their nuclear deterrence, that makes it more difficult for them to deter future attacks, actually could authorize them to launch their own nuclear attack. Now, I don't. There's no chance of that happening now. We just say that it does. But it does take us a step closer to that nuclear threshold, and that is very worrying. Again, especially if there was Western involvement. Now, there may not have been Western involvement in this case because these weren't long-range drones. These were FPV drones that were flown quite, you have to say, quite ingeniously. That were put in the backs of trucks. And what they were did, the trucks were taken close to these air bases, a total of 5 air bases, and parked there. And then the hatches were opened in the top, and these drones flew out and attacked the air bases. I think in the case of 3 air bases, the Russians say that all the drones were repelled, or shot down, or neutralized by electronic warfare. At 2 of the air bases, I believe one in Murmansk and one in Irkutsk, at those 2 bases, the attacks were at least partially successful and did cause some significant damage. Again, at least it appears a half a dozen bombers were destroyed or severely damaged. But again, these weren't long range drones that would have to fly over thousands of kilometers, and in which case they would rely on data that would have to be provided by the West. These were short range. So, FPV drones that were manually controlled. People who observed the flight patterns. Well, later we got the video footage. You could see everything indicated that it was a typical FPV drone that was manually controlled. So it was something that was done on Russian soil, and the Ukrainians are capable of doing something like this. Most of them speak Russian. Yeah, many of them as a native language. There are many Ukrainians living in Russia. I'm sure it's clear that they have quite an extensive network there. Yeah, the Ukrainian intelligence does. Um, Now, so it's something they could have pulled off on their own, but it's hard to believe that the Western intelligence didn't know about it, because we know Western intelligence works very closely with them. And in fact, it has been said, I think it was reported in the New York Times, that Ukrainian intelligence was built up from the ground, rebuilt up from the ground, really by the CIA. So, I mean, the CIA is just, and also MI6 are very close to Ukrainian intelligence, and they conduct many joint projects. They share intelligence, they work together, and they have many contacts at many levels. So this let's say ingenious plan, it's called Operation Spiderweb, by the way. Um, uh, you know, Took quite a while actually to carry out. According to the Ukrainians themselves, it took 18 months. So I think it is beyond. Um, It's just not believable that they did this and the Western intelligence didn't know about it. So at least they knew about it and must have given, their imprimatur to it. And that's worrying because, again, it is an attack on Russia's nuclear deterrence. Again, something that it takes us closer to, that terrifying threshold of nuclear war.
Right. It's hard for me to believe that the US Western intelligence wasn't aware of this. I don't think it's possible. 18 months,
Yeah.
um it, it's worrying because there's always this gray area when something like this happens. When Ukraine carries out an assassination, or the big one was that Crocus Music City Hall, then the giant arena shopping mall in Moscow that was a devastating terrorist attack. The perpetrators flew to Ukraine. It's like, what did the U.S. know? Because prior to that, we had Victoria Nuland said we have some nasty surprises for Putin, and then this carries out, and it's like, whoa, were we behind this? I have a sneaking suspicion we were, but of course, there's this deniability. It's the same thing in this situation, and this preceded Donald Trump saying, if it wasn't for me, there's some really, really bad things that will happen to Russia. This, and then all of a sudden, this happens. So, I think this big question in everybody's mind is, well, how much did the Americans know, or how much were they involved in this operation? And, do you think that Trump was aware of this? Because there was something that said that the Americans were aware of this operation like 40 minutes prior before it took off or something like this. And then all of a sudden they took it back and said, no, we didn't know anything about this.
Right. Yeah, you're referring to the Axios report. Axios is that news agency that is very closely tied to U.S. intelligence. They initially said that there was U.S. had prior knowledge of this, and then they retracted that. So, again, it's hard to believe that he didn't know something. I think the U.S. intelligence had to know something about what was going on. Probably knew quite a lot. They may have not known the exact day, the timing of it. It's possible that they were surprised by that, but they had to know that this was being planned. And again, it shows it is worrying, because Trump certainly should have been informed about this. Maybe he was, maybe he didn't pay attention to it. Who knows? If he was and he didn't do anything about it, then unfortunately we've seen more evidence that this is just Biden all over again. Because this is the kind of thing, that would have happened under Biden. He always allowed these escalations. Maybe sometimes he applied the brake very lightly, but to slow things down a bit. But in general, he was on a course of escalation. And this is an escalation. It's not the first time that actually Russia's strategic deterrence capabilities have been attacked. There was that attack on a over-the-horizon radar. I think it was sometime last year. But this is, clearly much wider in scale and impact.
Why do you think that the target were these strategic bombers that were, you said, in Murmansk?
Murmansk and Irkutsk.
Yeah,
those are the
Murmansk,
two where the attacks were successful.
Right, those are thousands of miles away from the battlefield. Does that have any impact on the battle itself? It sounds like these strategic bombers aren't something that's being used in the Ukraine campaign. Why, or are they? I mean,
actually they are, but it won't have an impact. They do, there's some of I believe the KH-101, maybe some other missiles are launched from these bombers. But there are many more bombers in the fleet. And they only need just a very small number of bombers to carry out even a large-scale attack. I think one bomber can carry a dozen missiles. And so just you get a few bombers in the sky, and they can still do that. That hasn't been affected. If they had taken out 41, it might have affected, in that case, truly affected their capability to launch some of these missile attacks. But I think it's clear that didn't happen. So you could make the argument, that... maybe that's what the Ukrainians were thinking. Is that let's these missile attacks are really hurting us. Let's go after the source, and that's the strategic bomber fleet there.
Right. Okay, that was going to be my question. Whether you think that this was pure degradation of your opponent's military capabilities, or was this escalation for the sake of escalation to try to obviously the game that Zelensky's playing is to draw in NATO.
I think it's probably more the latter. That you can, in this case, it is a valid military target. By the way, unlike the train attacks, maybe we could talk about those later. But these were, I think you can make the argument that they were valid military targets. That they were not terrorist attacks, even though the Russian government described them as such. I wouldn't call them. This is not classic terrorism. They were going after military infrastructure. Um, so it may be that they just saw that there's two birds with one stone. Again, maybe we can degrade their fleet and maybe thereby diminish or reduce the effectiveness of future missile attacks on Ukraine. That may have been part of their thinking, but they're always thinking about the information war and escalation. We've talked about that many times. It's clearly a provocation, and they're hoping. Yeah, it may seem the madness, but there is some sort of method to this madness. If we keep on escalating, eventually the Russians are going to hit back so hard that we'll have all the footage of smoking ruins in Kiev and whatever, and that'll cause a great outcry in the West, and and then NATO will actually intervene. This is our hope. This is really their only hope, to be honest. And so I'm sure that was a major part of the calculation here. Of course, remember that this was thought up 18 months ago, or maybe even longer ago. It was 18 months in development. But I think clearly they were doing things like that back then. It's been their strategy for a long time. It's not something new. These terrorist attacks and clear provocations. That's part of what the West, in particular, Kiev has been doing ever since the start of the war, really.
Hmm. Something that I've been seeing that is a bit potentially worrying is people saying that this is a huge escalation because of the targets themselves, these strategic bombers. And you mentioned it in the beginning that this degrades their nuclear deterrent capability. And so they could respond to this as a threat to that and escalate to the nuclear option, potentially even.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also, I've been hearing that this is violating something called the START Treaty. I'm not very familiar with this, but it's a Cold War treaty that says that these strategic bombers have to be in the open, that could be observable by satellite. So that way people can keep tabs on it. And so people are aware, like, oh, is there a nuclear attack going on? Same as like the location of nuclear silos, this type of thing. I don't know if you have any insight on that, if you think
Yeah,
that that's...
actually, that I hadn't heard. That's very interesting and may be true. I mean, the START Treaty, it was a very, very important arms limitation treaty that was, I believe, it may have been even earlier. I think it was inked back in the 1980s anyway, I believe. And it was very important. So, and I think it's basically the only arms limitation treaty that remains in effect between the two countries. So if it was a violation of that, that would be a very serious matter. And, I really don't know the details, but that does kind of make sense. That's part of what it was important to have, verification. Again, you had to be open about what you had. So that may be in fact true. That's quite interesting.
Right. I mean, it makes sense if you think
Right.
about if these bombers are way out there in the, and way up north in Murmansk or way out in Siberia, or there's no reason for them to be out in the open. They would have them probably stored somewhere.
Well, I think actually it wouldn't be unusual. I mean, they're so large that it is hard to house them. um,
But I mean, I think part of the reason as well, like I said, is because of the START Treaty.
it could be.
So yeah. Well, anyways, that's something that we can look into more later. But if
Right.
that is a clear violation and what that means, I'm not sure the ramifications of
I
something
kind
like
of
that.
wonder if it was a clear violation because I did read Scott Ritter's comments, and of course he was involved in these negotiations, and he knows these treaties inside out, and he didn't mention anything about it. I mean, he pointed out that the fact that this does authorize the Russian government under their clearly stated, publicly stated nuclear doctrine to actually go nuclear. And so, if it violated the START treaty, I think he would have mentioned it, but, we'll see. We'll find out. We'll get
Okay.
confirmation or otherwise later.
Right. Well, so the purpose of this attack by Ukraine, we kind of say, is twofold. One is the direct, degrading of military capability of Russia, but the other, the more important aspect of this is the information war, the ability to try to get the West drawn back into this conflict and to get Trump into this conflict and to see if NATO can come to the aid of Ukraine fully and really start World War III. How effective do you think that this operation was in achieving something like that?
Well, all these provocations so far have failed because they're dealing with, Mr. Cool himself, Vladimir Putin. And we have never seen him respond emotionally to anything that's been done, often to the frustration of the people around him. But that's who he is, and so I don't think it's going to be successful at all. If that was the aim, and I think it was the aim.
Well, Putin has to respond, right? You believe that?
Yeah, I think yeah. But again, it'll be carefully calibrated, and as we've seen in the past,
It's a fine line to tread, though,
it is.
because the narrative that's coming out now is that, whoa, look, Ukraine is still in this fight. Everyone's saying Ukraine's on its last legs. Zelensky doesn't have any cards, is what Trump said, and now there's these memes going around. Zelensky has all the cards. He's got four aces in his hand right now. So if that's true, if that narrative keeps on being pushed out, and we know how susceptible someone like Trump is to narratives, then all of a sudden it's like, yeah, maybe we can win this war. Ukraine is in the fight. We just have to put a little bit more pressure, take the gloves off, let them do their thing, and we'll be fine. So that's the other risk. If he doesn't respond forcefully, this also gives impetus for the West to get more involved. And it's like, actually, yeah, we can do this. We can push it back. Like you said, you look at the map, it's hardly moved in the past 3 years. Russia doesn't, they can't handle it. That's what's going to be pushed out there.
Yeah, I think there's no question about it, and that's been true of all kinds of Ukrainian provocations and really harebrained schemes like the Kursk incursion or the Krinky beachhead. When these were launched, they were always spun or used as evidence again of Ukrainian ingenuity. The Ukrainian capability too. Again, clearly they're not out of the fight. They've got the Russians. Took them by surprise. The Russians have been are retreating in Kursk. They can't eliminate the Krinky beachhead, and they get certain mileage for a few months at least, and then of course the whole thing fails, and they'll get mileage out of this too. There's no question. So it's something that Zelensky and the Ukrainians, I think, are quite good at. They understand their Western audience. They pull off these stunts. Again, the military impact, the impact on what's actually happening at the battlefronts is minimal, or often just zero. There's no impact whatsoever. But they get all that. They get a lot of mileage in terms of information warfare, and that it just gives the impression it enables Western leaders to maintain their delusions. I think it helps them. They latch onto these. Keir Starmer and others, when these happen, they say, yeah, Ukraine can do it. We've got to stand by Ukraine. We've got to send them another 100 tanks or whatever if we have them. Well, we don't, but we'll send them 20 or something. They'll send them $5 billion in any case. We'll do that, 5 billion euros. So it is effective. It does help Ukraine stay in the fight a little bit longer. It doesn't avert the final defeat, by any means. It doesn't fundamentally change the course of the war, not even close to it. And while all this was going on, the Russians continued to advance. They're advancing at a faster rate than they have any time earlier this year, and they're pretty much back up to where they were at their peak in November of last year. And there's no reason to think that anything the Ukrainians did is going to affect that. But in information land, you'd have to say it's a victory for the Ukrainians.
Right, and that will and can affect the course of the war, right? I mean, if we're
It
seeing
won't
these,
affect the ultimate outcome, but it can, yeah, prolong it.
yeah. Well, I mean, just the fear that I have is that we might get involved in a direct conflict with Russia. The way things are going, like the chance of a negotiated peace settlement right now seems absurd. Especially there's supposed to be talks
Yeah.
in Istanbul right now. It's not going to happen, and we see these attempts to escalate, and just the willingness of Western European leaders to to do whatever it takes to get their countries more and more involved in this war. And so it's just this slow creep that I'm afraid is
Hmm.
going to happen. And then all of a sudden, before you know it, yeah, we have to send troops to Ukraine. Oh, clearly, this is that it'll slow. They'll be able to make the narrative, control it enough to get that messaging out, and then this actually happens. Like that's what I'm afraid about. I mean, you
Yeah.
mentioned like Kursk or Crinky Bridgehead as getting a lot of mileage out of those operations, but I feel like this operation they can get even more mileage because first it was deep into Russian territory, and they're not going to have the same type of clear defeat and with these
Mm.
operations because Krinky and Kursk and most analysts were like, this was stupid. They're not going to be able to hold on to this. This was a terrible idea. It was clear to everybody. And then they have to, all of a sudden, they lose all these men, all these equipment. And they're like, oops, yeah, they look dumb. They're not going to have that same type of
Hmm.
fallout from this type of operation. What they'll have is potentially a Russian retaliation, which gives them more mileage in their PR campaign saying, look at the Russia just attacking us needlessly,
Hmm.
with no reason whatsoever, bombing our kindergartens, this type of stuff.
Right. No, I think you're right. Actually, this is probably the most successful. Uh, will will prove to be the most successful of all their sons. As for Kursk and Krinky, yeah, it's true. A lot of the military analysts, right from the start, were saying, this doesn't really make sense. But the, you know, but by and large, in the mainstream media, you're getting a lot of very enthusiastic, almost deliriously optimistic kind of reports initially, especially in the case of the Kursk incursion, and that lasted for a few months, and then they gradually kind of it disappeared, and now nobody talks about it. That never happened. It didn't matter. It wasn't important. Whatever.
Right.
But yeah, but so they. It's funny actually in the case of Zelensky. He got so much out of it that it was obviously very very important to him that Kursk incursion, and even to this day he pretends that they're still in Kursk. They're nowhere near to being in Kursk, but he still pretends like it's still going on. Um, yeah. So anyway, yeah, but I think you're right. I think you're right. This is going to doesn't really have a downside for them in terms of information warfare, because right, it did damage, clearly did do damage to the Russian military machine, and um, and yeah, apparently the agents have, at least according to the Ukrainians, they're all back in Ukraine already. So they really didn't suffer any losses other than the monetary loss and the resource loss. Obviously they invested a lot into this, and if you really analyze it carefully, you might find out that, well, considering the costs involved for them and the damage they inflicted, it was more of a wash than anything. But people are not going to think about that. The people are going to look at the success of it, and again, in informational terms, it was very successful.
Right. Does this make it harder for Trump to walk away from Ukraine?
Um, I don't see why it really should, but I mean, if Trump were really disciplined and he, had his eye on the
Well,
ball, he made a decision. But he's not. Okay, you're right. So it could affect. Who knows how it's going to affect him? His view of the things. It's really hard for me to say. I mean, like that those recent tweets about, I don't know what happened to Putin. The man has gone crazy. And what. Uh, um, that whole thing seems so absurd and so far removed from reality. It's I just don't have any idea. Maybe he'll say Zelensky's gone crazy, and he'll go move closer to Putin. But who knows? I really don't
right.
know. I'm not going to make any guesses on that.
Yeah. But if you just look at what's happened in the past, 10 days or so, it's been pretty bad. Just the language coming out of Trump, the rhetoric, and then this attack. It feels
Yeah.
like we are rapidly escalating. Do you feel the same?
Well, okay, again, this certainly was an escalation. But we've seen similar escalations in the past, and we've survived them, again, because of the kind of leadership that we have in Moscow, really. Now, I think the bigger issue is the whole question of the Taurus missiles and the restrictions on long range missiles into pre 2014 Russia. Has have those restrictions been lifted? Have the Taurus missiles been sent? If indeed they have, then we're right back on, the escalatory ladder that Biden put us on, and that would be very, very disheartening. But we don't know yet. They're just we're wondering. We got these cryptic comments from Mertz, and it's and then a lot of contradictory reports. We don't know if, in fact, these Taurus missiles have been sent. We don't know if any restrictions have been lifted. We haven't gotten any statement on that. I guess that's kind of worrying. It's just that on the American side, we're not getting any statements to the contrary. And I find that somewhat disturbing. You should say, no, the policy hasn't changed. President Putin or President Trump rather is solidly opposed to this. We're not hearing that, so it makes you wonder. That's
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
for me the more worrying thing.
Very true. Yeah, because Trump was openly just saying how stupid it was for Biden to do this. And now it's like, why aren't you saying that, hey, Mertz, Starmer, you guys are stupid for saying this.
Yeah,
We're not doing that.
right.
And
Shut
we're
up.
not. Right, right. You had no qualm saying it with Biden, but now he's not saying it. So it's a little bit troubling. So how do you think this is going to affect negotiations right now in Istanbul? Do you think are
Yeah,
they even going to even happening? I mean, like
yeah.
what?
They already happened apparently. They took place today, and I think they ended, like an hour ago or maybe half an hour ago. It, that's the last I heard anyway. I just saw that report. I think just shortly before we began this program. I I don't think the negotiations at this point, they're clearly not going to lead to any sort of settlement. I think it's good that it's happening. I mean, just because maybe we're laying the groundwork for future negotiation, continuation of negotiations, which maybe at some point in the conflict really could lead to something, but they're not going to lead to anything now. And I, there are a lot of reports. I don't know. Many people claim that like these attacks, both the railway attacks and the airbase attacks were intended to derail the negotiations. But I don't see that. I don't see why they would need to do something, like that to derail the negotiations. Um, in fact, they could simply not show up. They don't have to go to such great lengths to derail the negotiations. Or, as they chose to do, they did show up, which I think was a smart thing to do. And you know what they're going to do. So, again, the Russians are going to present their demands, and the Ukrainians are after going to say this was completely outrageous. Clearly, they're not serious. They're um, and all their statements are going to be echoed and amplified by Western media. And why would you want to derail that? I mean, I think there was nothing for them to really fear in this case.
I wonder if they almost saw it as an opportune moment based on Trump's comments of saying that, Trump seems to be turning a little bit on the Russians. And then he says that they can real pain can be inflicted on Russia or something really, really bad might happen. And
Oh,
they're
so
like,
yeah, it
oh,
says some terrible things. Okay, he's implied could have happened, but
right.
but might still happen. I guess.
Yeah, I wish I looked at it before, but yeah,
Yeah,
something along those lines. Right. I think
right.
people know.
Um, yeah, who knows? Who knows? Again, this has long been in the planning. Of course, when it started, they had no idea there were going to be negotiations or that Donald Trump even was going to be president. Um, so it was going to happen in any case. Maybe they chose this to coincide with the negotiation or Trump statements. They felt that it was a particularly opportune moment. I don't know. Or maybe it was just, that was the planning from months ago. This was the time to do it, and they just went ahead with it. I think above all, they just wanted to be sure of success, and so they probably considered a lot of local factors on the ground. I imagine if you're in charge of a complex operation like that, you want to make sure that like all the stars are are aligned when you do it, and that's your main concern. It's not even what's happening in the media landscape, but that's my speculation.
Right. Do you think this will carry any weight on the decision to allow for long range strikes into Russia for Western countries? Do you think that has any effect?
Well, it could. I mean, if the Russians don't respond at all, then it may encourage the West to go ahead to resume those strikes into undisputed Russian territory. That's a possibility. If the Russians respond forcefully, again, that may risk a further escalation on the Western side, but it might also convince the West that, okay, yeah, maybe we should, maybe we should maintain these restrictions. This is a dangerous road. I'm sure the Russians are looking at all those factors right now.
When something like this attack happens, does Russia view it as an attack by Ukraine, or do they view it more as an attack by NATO with Ukraine? Is this just an attack
Yeah.
by the West in general?
Yeah. Well, in case of these air-based attacks, again, I think the Ukrainians could have carried that out on their own, but they're just, as we're saying, I think there has to be a degree of Western complicity, and so yeah, I think they probably do look at it as a NATO attack. I mean, if NATO did not want this to happen, say, hey, yeah, this crosses the red line. This is their nuclear deterrence. We really don't want to go down that road. They could have stopped it. I'm sure they could have. Um, so yeah, so I think the Russians do look at it as a general attack by the West.
Okay, well that's scary, right? I mean,
Yeah, it
this
is.
is what I mean. I mean, how does this compare in terms of escalations? Like allowing attackums. Because there were specific regions that were allowed to be attacked with the attackums, right? They were saying
Right.
just basically right across. There was a
Yeah.
short
Initially,
range.
right. They said Kursk, but they ended up also striking, I think, well, Bryansk and maybe
Bryansk.
Belgorod as well. Um, there may have been even another region. So they quickly went beyond the initially stated scope. But it was still, they weren't, well, they didn't even have the means. I mean, these missiles like the ATACMS have a range of 300 kilometers, or roughly 190 miles. And they, couldn't get anywhere close to Moscow. And they can't be fired right from the front lines because it's just simply too dangerous. There's just an almost certainty the Russians will find the launchers and destroy them even before the missiles are fired. So they have to be fired a distance back. Um, so they were limited in the range that they could. But if they get the Taurus, of course, that's different. It could at least get to the outskirts of Moscow. It's my understanding. I put a ruler on the map, and that's what I saw for 500 kilometers. Um,
Right. Well, what makes me think of this as a very, very major escalation, maybe even above the ATACMS, is that probably Russia knows that, okay, the West was involved in this. And before they kind of knew the range of these attacks, right, from the missiles, they can
mhm,
prepare for it. But here we're talking about thousands of miles inside of
mhm.
Russia,
Yeah.
so all of a sudden it brings the war much closer to home. And it's like, like you said, Russia views it as a terrorist attack. Like you said, these are military targets and they are being used in the war, so
Mhm,
it's objective. But I understand that kind of gray zone because of the way
mhm,
that the operation was carried out. You're smuggling these devices in. If they wanted to target civilian infrastructure or energy infrastructure, something like that, they definitely could have. This type of operation. It it kind of reminds me a little bit of the pager attack that Israel carried out. Something really deep in planning that was hidden and then activated, but not to that level of that where we can just say that that was a terrorist attack here in Russia. So I feel like the sentiment in Russia has to be at boiling point when it comes to Ukraine with this type of attack deep inside Russia. There's going to be a lot of pressure to get the gloves off on Putin. I don't know. Maybe Russia's Pearl Harbor is hyperbole. I don't think it's something that we know that Putin isn't somebody that wants to escalate the war, and he thank God. But there's going to be a lot of pressure, and I think he's going to have to respond quite forcefully. I think there's got to be a lot of anger within Russia now.
Yeah. Well, I think actually, like the pressure concerning the airbase attacks is probably going to be more within the military. This was, I think it also needs to be added that, yeah, this demonstrates that Russia is vulnerable to these kind of attacks that are carried out on their own soil. One thing, first, Russia is a very large country with a lot of Ukrainians. There are people with connections to Ukraine. That's just the nature of Russian demographics. The Ukrainians are everywhere. Now, the vast majority of these Ukrainians are very strongly pro-Russian, and that's why they're in Russia. But not all of them. It's easy for somebody to sneak in with from Ukraine, a Russian speaker, and to pose as one of these pro-Russian Ukrainians, but then meanwhile, work with Ukrainian intelligence. And it's, I'm sure that the Russians are aware of this and they're doing what they can, but it's a very large country. We're talking about a lot of people. And, in spite of what the West says, Russia is a free society. It has, in this case, there was apparently the Ukrainians actually purchased or their agents there purchased a warehouse and actually assembled the drones in the warehouse within Russia. And that could not happen in a totalitarian, a highly authoritarian society. This was because there is a lot of freedom. There are entrepreneurs and they say, oh yeah, you want to buy a warehouse? Of course, I'll sell it to you. And so that makes Russia vulnerable. I don't think they're going to be able to shut down these kind of attacks entirely. Of course they've had success in disrupting plots, preventing assassinations from going forward. We seem like you hear about those kind of cases at least every other week, but they can't get them all. Now, I'm sure they'll learn from this, and they're going to and probably take measures to protect the bombers. Maybe they will have to build hard structures to protect them. I think that they've already done that for air bases that are closer to Ukraine, but now they realize that maybe they have to do it throughout the country. We'll see. Anyway, I'm not sure if I answered your question, but
I don't even remember my question anymore, but I'm sure you did a good job with it. But yeah, I'm just this asymmetrical warfare this term that we keep on using. It's this gray area, where I'm trying to figure out what's acceptable in war, and we're going to see Ukraine as it's not able to inflict damage conventionally. It has to resort to this asymmetrical warfare, which is flirting with terrorism, and some of it is outright terrorism, when we have assassinations or just direct attacks on civilian targets. But that seems to be the evolution that we're seeing Ukraine go. This is the only success that they're having is when they engage in this. Conventionally, the United States, we aren't able to provide anything that is allowing them to beat the Russians conventionally on the battlefield. What's changing the difference are drones and this type of asymmetrical warfare. And it's becoming, I think, the U.S. method, because I think there's a realization that our military-industrial complex doesn't work. And it's just kind of ironic because we had this whole war on terror that the United States started after 9/11. And now it's just like we are the biggest sort of orchestrators of terror via our proxies, via Israel, via Ukraine, and our intelligence, the Mossad and the CIA. They are the terror puppets. And it's terrifying that they're there and they're watching everything and they're coordinating things. And, it's going to be I don't know, how do you defeat this type of problem? It's a hard thing to destroy. You can always obfuscate as the intelligence agency and saying, oh, it wasn't us, as you're going through proxies. You can't destroy it as easily conventionally on the battlefield. So that's what I'm worried about. It's just that we'll see more and more of this. And how do you root that out? How do you get that out? Especially if it's backed by the brain that's stationed in the Pentagon or out of some headquarters in Germany. Like, if this keeps on happening, eventually you're going to have to go after those command structures, right? That are operating this type of these asymmetric warfare attack. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what
Right.
worries
Well,
me.
I would say that um, it isn't clear that the U.S., for example, the CIA is behind these out and out terrorist attacks, like the pager attacks in Lebanon. But it, or the clearly, like, at least one of these train incidents that clearly was a terrorist attack. It's just it meets all the criteria for terrorism. Um, but I don't know. I don't think we have anything close to proof that the Western intelligence is behind these kind of attacks. But it's hard to believe they didn't know something about it, that they're complicit. And even if they didn't know, they have, they're so important to these countries, to West intelligence support is so important to Israel and to Ukraine, that if in fact we felt that they had gone too far, they had crossed the red line, we have the ability to prevent them from doing that again. You could come down hard and say, wait a second, you guys are completely out of line. We're going to just stop all intelligence sharing, for a month, and then we're going to start discussing how, maybe you're going to start behaving yourself. They could stop it, and clearly they haven't. So it's just like, at least there is complicity. There is, because they are supporting these agencies. Maybe not, they're not actually supporting these individual terrorist operations, but they just have to know about it. Or even if they don't, they can, after they occur, they can certainly, really lay down the law, and they're just not doing that. Yeah, it's enough of a gray area that I, I think that probably the Russians are very, very reluctant to use this as a justification for a major escalation. But an accumulation of these kind of incidents could lead to a major escalation. We are playing with fire just by being so close to these agencies. And if, again, if we see more and more terrorist attacks carried out by Ukraine, um, it'll be the pressure on Russia to do something about it, to really, again, to escalate in a very meaningful manner that pressure can only grow. And even Vladimir Putin, Mr. Cool himself, may just feel like he has to do something, major.
Right. I mean, you can't have these types of attacks happening within Russia and stay in power, forever. He has to
Yeah,
resolve that problem.
yeah,
And I
right.
mean,
Yeah, there was
obviously he's trying and he's being cool and he wants to
right,
do it the conventional by the book way, but there's I think pressure is mounting for him
right,
to strike harder.
right.
Yeah, we'll
There
see.
was a lot of anger again about the attack, the bridge demolition that in Briansk, the one that caused the bridge to fall down on the passenger train and to kill maybe a dozen people and injure about 100 people. There's a lot of anger within Russia about that.
Right. So I did hear a little bit about that. Do you want to explain a little bit more what
Okay,
happened?
apparently there were two attacks. One in Bryansk. Bryansk is right next to Kursk. It's just a little bit to the west of Kursk. And what happened is that a sabotage team of the Ukrainians went in um, and installed explosives on this bridge, and I think maybe on the rail line itself. They were actually spotted. There was some sort of report that a sabotage team had been seen, but they managed to escape and make it back into Ukraine. Apparently that they were spotted after they had already installed these explosives. Now it was timed so that the explosives detonated just as the passenger train was passing underneath, so it caused a lot of loss of life, many injuries. Again, I think about a dozen killed and 100 people injured. Um, Now, I've heard some arguments maybe this was basically a military target that had civilian casualties, but it was they in fact cleared everything up within 12 to 24 hours. I've heard both, like within half a day or a day, and the trains are running there again. So it really didn't affect their logistics. Now it'll take some time. It was a road bridge that was demolished. It'll take some time to do that. But again, most military equipment, the vast majority in both Ukraine and in Russia, is transported by rail. Now the other one was in Kursk region, and what they took out a rail bridge, and it caused the bridge went out and the train crashed. It caused injuries to the crew, but apparently no one was killed. And so again, the consequences of that weren't clear. It's not completely clear to me whether that was a passenger train or a freight train or a military train. If it was a military train, then that would be a legitimate logistics target. But I haven't heard that. But the other one is clearly terrorist in nature. The one that occurred in Bryansk.
Okay, right. I mean, so like I said, blood's got to be boiling in Russia.
Yeah.
Let's see how Putin manages it. If he's able to keep everybody cool, or if he's going to succumb to pressure to strike even harder.
Right.
And then you're wondering, like, I just wonder, like, maybe that is the right option. Maybe that's what Putin needs to do at this point, because this placating the West is not working. They don't seem to appreciate his efforts to try to keep this slow and steady from blowing up. Instead, they just get more and more upset with him and try to poke the bear even harder. So it's scary.
Yeah, and they also just seem to perceive any restraint on the Russian side as a sign of weakness.
Right. That's exactly
right.
So I think, I don't know.
And
Well, what do you think?
Similar.
Do you think it's time for him to hit harder?
It's hard. I wish I could give an easy answer, but if there is a legitimate military target, that would be considered an escalation, but it is a legitimate military target. There's something that where the Russians haven't gone to before, then sure, hit it hard. I don't know what that would be. Maybe a command and control center. In general, that they seem to have regarded those as kind of as off limits. And maybe they have to start saying that, okay, now that you're doing these kind of attacks, those are, those command and control centers are fair game. And, we're going to start hitting those. And I think that could potentially sober up the Ukrainians. Zelensky talks tough, but he doesn't mind sacrificing his people on the front line. But if there's a chance that he and his buddies get killed in one of these strikes, he may reconsider it. Now, I don't think the Russians really do not want to cause the death of Zelensky. I think they understand that this guy is a clown, that actually he makes very, very bad military decisions that have been to the benefit of Russia, and they would like to just keep him in power. It doesn't really help them, but maybe lower level command and control centers that they have, in general have avoided striking. Maybe they're going to go after those now. That's just a thought. That would make sense to me.
I want to go back to the intelligence agencies just a little bit, because that seems to be our number one contribution to this war, is the intelligence, our directing. And like I said, that New York Times article that showed that it was more than just intelligence sharing. It's battlefield tactics, directing of attacks, high involvement. But I'm wondering, is the CIA and I hear like Mossad, are they essentially the same thing? Like that there's a real tight relationship. Like who is really in control of the intelligence agencies? Because we saw the intelligence agencies go after Trump, and Trump was supposed to be somebody that was supposed to clean out and drain the swamp when it comes to these things. But, has he just fallen victim to the intelligence agencies again? And who is in charge? How much influence does a country like Israel have over the intelligence agencies, and what is going on? What do we see? What do we know? Do they only show Trump what they want to show him? It almost feels like a rogue element.
Yeah, well, there's always that danger with intelligence agencies. Now, the person who's in charge in showing intelligence to Trump is Tulsi Gabbard. And, she may not be perfect, but we know that she is not one of them. She's not, the establishment. She certainly has had that history. And you would think that that she would be giving him a fair assessment of what's happening, in particular, what's happening in Ukraine. Um, Now, what I have heard, actually, it was Chas Freeman, the former ambassador, said this, that you know there is a weekly intelligence report that is delivered to the president, and President Trump just doesn't read it. He just doesn't. Apparently, Vice President Vance reads it very carefully, but Trump doesn't. And so, even though he has this vast intelligence apparatus and he has an honest DNI director providing him with this intelligence, he just doesn't have the attention span or the curiosity, which seems quite extraordinary, but this is apparently true. It's apparently true in his first term as well. Um, so he gets his information. There are oral reports that are given to him, and I think he listens to these. I don't know how much it's absorbed, but he also watches TV. People like General Kellogg, you could give him their version of events, and all this soaks into his brain, and then you get this chaotic, inconsistent, all the chaotic, inconsistent statements that we've been hearing over the years. That's part of it. So it's not really so much that the intelligence agencies are maybe controlling the show. I don't think Mossad, clearly has a close relationship with the CIA, but they don't control the CIA. It's, um, they clearly do what they constantly are doing. They are just one of the means, Mossad, by which Israel pressures and tries to manipulate U.S. policy vis-a-vis the Middle East. We see, clearly, the most direct means is through the mega donors, but then also through Congress, and we've talked about that. The AIPAC's control over Congress, and then Mossad is just a third element. It's just part of the arsenal of weapons. You could, figuratively speaking, that the Israelis have. One example of what Mossad may do is, again, the whole Epstein affair. We've talked about that. You have these honey traps. You get compromising photos, and then you blackmail U.S. politicians. I think that's a tried and true intelligence tactic, and I'm sure that the Israelis have been using that. Mossad has been using that. But I wouldn't say that it's Mossad. I just don't see it. They have, clearly Israel has levers out in the open, which they use quite openly. But yeah, Mossad is part of it, part of the way that they influence policy within this country.
Yeah, I mean, I just hear about this very tight relationship between the CIA and Mossad and all this intelligence sharing. And it's like how much of Mossad is actually in the CIA and the CIA and Mossad. It becomes
Yeah,
this mixing,
right.
dual loyalty issues.
Well, a lot of it we just don't know. It's a very murky world,
Right,
and
exactly.
occasionally
That's
there's
what I'm saying. It's
right,
just,
a shaft of light, and we hear something. Somebody will write a book after a career in the CIA or the Mossad, and there's a lot of really frightening things that come out. And it's clear that these governments, they want to they try to use these intelligence agencies, but then the intelligence agencies can end up manipulating the governments. And of course, we saw that in Trump's first term. There was the intelligence agencies were part of this effort to essentially carry out a coup against Trump. Now this time, he seems like he came in with some understanding of what happened to him last time, and he's been fighting hard to gain control over these agencies, and I think he's probably had some success. But the potential for, again, for manipulation by intelligence communities of their own governments is always there.
Right. Yeah, something that I think has happened over the past couple of years is that Israel kind of has set the bar on what's acceptable to engage in, and I can see them wanting to encourage Ukraine to kind of stoop to their level because it takes a little bit of pressure off of Israel if they see, okay, well, the other Western proxy to engage in this type of activity. But it is just something that, I mean, what we've seen, how the West celebrated the pager attack. Like that has become okay. That's something that's how the West fights wars now. And it's I think it's building up towards this acceptance of asymmetrical warfare to legitimize it. And I think that's scary because we're flirting with just open terrorism when we go down this road.
Right.
And as the more we legitimize the actions of Israel, it gives more sort of free range for Ukraine to engage in similar types of activity.
Yeah.
And this is awful.
Yeah.
We're backing the West is backing two states that are becoming more and more like rogue terrorist states, and those are our guys.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
like it. I don't
Right.
like it.
Yeah. Right. Well, yeah, we've talked about this before, but it's very true. It's a very important point that by associating ourselves with these countries, I think we're seeing it's not just that we're well, in the case of Ukraine, clearly we're using them. In the case of Israel, I think it's more Israel using us. Um, but in both cases, just by associating them, we're becoming infected with some of the same problems. I mean, again, our standards are being lowered, and you saw it very, very clearly, like in the during the attacks on Yemen, and again, the sort of we were doing the kind of things in Yemen that Israel did in Lebanon. Clearly, well, in one case there was at least an attempted decapitation strike, and he took out a whole apartment building full of civilians. And again, we had you know, our vice president and others, top officials watching this and celebrating it. And I'd like to again remind people that it wasn't always this way. At least, it was something that, yeah, there have always been war crimes, but there was kind of awareness that you didn't want to be seen as having committed one, and you were supposed to be concerned about civilian casualties. So we even had George W. Bush, criticize the Israelis for causing what we would say now is a very minimal number of civilian casualties in an attack on Hamas leadership. We're talking about single figures, and he criticized them for it. And then, of course, in the case of Nasrallah, we're talking about hundreds of people, and there was just nobody ever criticized them at all. And then we ourselves went ahead and did something similar in Yemen. And yeah, like what I just wonder. Well, recently there was clearly this terrorist attack that took place in Bryansk. The bridge that was brought down on the passenger train. And have you heard any condemnation, in the West? I haven't heard anything. Just not, nothing. It's just outright terrorist attack. Just look the other way. And you can only do that, the more often you do that, the more you become complicit, the more you become, like these people that are committing these attacks. You become very much an accomplice to their conduct.
Yeah, I think it's seeping through to the general population. I think it's becoming more and more difficult for the average citizen to think that we are the good guys now. Do you believe that's true? That within the West, do most of the Western population, we know the elites, they're all delusional, whatever, but the average citizen, do they still believe that the West is sort of this righteous power? We are the good guys and we need to support, like
A
Ukraine or
lot of
Israel?
people clearly do. A lot of people still buy into it, and I think especially our elites. But yeah, I think there has been. I mean that faith, just like in so many other areas, we do see a real, you know, a real shift in public opinion. I think there is a growing awareness. And I have to say that like Donald Trump himself is responsible for this, not in part anyway, in good part, not because he has been particularly savage, in his attacks. Or if anything, you could even argue the reverse. But he's been very open about things. Um, I think it was during his first term that actually there was. Oh, yeah, I think it may have been in some sort of media interview that the journalist said, claimed that that Putin was a cold-blooded killer, and with the and Trump responded. He says, like, you don't think that we don't have cold-blooded killers, or our presidents can't be cold-blooded killers. Uh, it's just a kind of a he doesn't, even if his behavior isn't really all that different from previous presidents. He doesn't make that effort um, to to cover it up with pretty language and the language of human rights and so forth. There is a kind of a crudity, and you can say almost an honesty about it in the case of Trump. But that in a way that's good. It allows people to see more clearly. But then, of course, the danger is then that it's part of this process where people actually just begin to before maybe they were hypocrites. They knew, this is not good, but I'll support Zionism or whatever because and we'll cover up with what we're doing with this pretty language. Well, now the mask is off, and in part thanks to Donald Trump, and people's either you'd hope some people recoil in horror, and I think that happens, but a lot of people go ahead and just embrace it openly. Before they had to be hypocrites, they don't need to be hypocrites anymore. Say, yeah, let's kill them. Let's kill Russians. Let's kill Palestinians.
But that's not the majority of opinion of people in the West, is it?
I don't think it's the majority. No, I don't think it's the majority. But it is a disturbing, phenomenon.
Right. Yeah, I'm just thinking if I don't know. It's hard to see the poll. I don't know the sentiment of this. I think a lot of people's views with Russia are superficial. I feel like with Israel Palestine, there are
Right.
because it's so visceral what we're seeing that there are stronger opinions there. But as things begin to become more and more real, as the threat of a real conflict between NATO and Russia rise, I think people will start to look at it more closely and start to understand things and do deeper dives. And if the majority of the Western population no longer views the Western hegemony as a force of good, that we are the bad guys, then in essence, Western hegemony is over. You can't have Western hegemony if your population views you as the bad guy, right? I mean, and I think that might be just a whole nother aspect of this. That's what's happening throughout these conflicts, is that more and more people start to go down these roads and just, I mean, I've always been aware to some extent that the U.S. isn't exactly the good guy, but following these conflicts over the past couple of years is really hardened my position on just like, man, Western hegemony it's more than just we're the bad guy. This is evil. This needs to stop. And I think more and more people come to that conclusion and speak out against it, that in itself, you think, could cause Western hegemony to collapse?
Well, it could. We've spoken about it. The three legs of Western hegemony, and one of them is soft power, and that that's something not to be underestimated. Again, that's where people give their voluntary consent to their rulers, to their governments. That's what gives a government legitimacy. And when that's withheld, the government ceases to have legitimacy, and it can't really just stand on the other two legs, by themselves, and it's going to fall. I think we've seen that. It can stand for a while, but it just can't stand very long. So we're not there yet. Of course, there are a lot of people, a disturbingly large number of people that still, I think, maybe out of inertia more than anything. I think maybe you will find that the faith that people have in the U.S. government and the goodness of let's say Western leadership is still there, but it's not very strongly held among ordinary people. I think it's becoming, even when maybe you'll see that there's a majority, it's a shallow majority. So if it comes to, again, a struggle where, again, these Western leaders want to intervene and fight Russia directly, you may find that, okay, all those people that said, yeah, we're the good guys, who say, well, I don't want to do this fight. I don't believe in it. Hey, I said yes, but I don't believe that. My faith in your goodness is really, it doesn't go so far as isn't so deep that I am going to risk my life for you. And again, I think we'll see the effects of soft power, of this diminution of Western soft power. It is very, very important, and it limits what these governments can do.
Right. Yeah, no, I'm getting to the point where I have lost basically any hope of some type of negotiated settlement in the Middle East or in Ukraine, Russia. And I feel like what's going to happen is that this war is going to keep on dragging out until these two proxies, Israel and Ukraine, eventually drain the United States of all of our what we call the three legs, all of its military power. We've retreated the United States militarily to the point where it's no longer able to engage properly in a conventional warfare. Economically, just drain it financially, and we're seeing a lot of pressure on this. Let's just rack up more debt to restart a military industrial complex within Europe or whatever it is they're trying to do. Just going to rack up trillions in debt and then drain the soft power. All the three of these things, Israel and Ukraine, are just sucking the life out of these three pillars of Western hegemony. And it's going to keep on doing that until it completely collapses, until there's just complete military collapse, defeat, a complete financial collapse, defeat, or financial collapse, or a complete moral collapse. I mean, I think all three of these are happening, and I don't know if we need. I think it's just these wars are going to grind on until the whole system just collapses. Do you think that's what we're looking at?
Well, you may be right. I think again, maybe, yeah, you certainly may be right. We are seeing danger signals, let's say, on all three of those main pillars of support. They're all starting to crack, or they're all going wobbly. Again, just actually predicting, giving a date is difficult. But if I was going to pitch my tent, I wouldn't pitch my tent right there.
Right.
You have the sense it could happen anytime. Anytime might be tomorrow. It might be some years from now, but it could happen in the not so distant future. I think we're getting there.
Right. Yeah, we need to coin a proper term for the three pillars of Western hegemony.
Yeah, I think of the three legs of a stool, or maybe because that's a stool has three legs. But a stool is not a very majestic thing. A stool falls over. It's not.
I think
not
pillars
a kind of
are better.
yeah,
I like
pillars. Probably pillars are better because you think of some sort of massive structure, some sort of imperial structure,
Right.
and the imperial structure is in danger of collapsing. So maybe we should stick with pillars.
All right, we'll stick with pillars.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, is there anything else we want to cover? I know we didn't touch really on the situation in Gaza at all today, but
Yeah.
maybe we can
Well,
save
let
that
me
for
just say
Wednesday.
very briefly that the Iranians recently responded to, I guess, a written proposal from the Americans, and they said that this is just absurd. We're not even close. So it sounds like that they were hoping that there was some sort of compromise, something that they could work with, continue to negotiate about. But apparently, the American proposal was just so far off. He said, "This we can't do anything with this. I'm sorry." So anyway, it looks like it's hard to know what's going on. I don't think Trump actually wants to go to war with Iran, but at the same time, he's listening to all these, crazy Zionists around him, and so he's putting forth, instructing Witkoff to present these impossible proposals, and so we just have chaos, and there is a danger. And because these Iranians are outright rejecting it, I don't know how Trump will respond now. If he'll wake up to the fact that he's getting bad advice and actually resume reasonable negotiations, or if we're going to go down the military road, the attack, which would be, of course, just almost suicidal. Talking about the end of empire, that would be a big step towards the end of empire if we do that.
All I see is chaos ahead, Dad. I don't see us taking any off ramps. Do you think human being civilization, will we survive? I mean, or is it inevitable that there's going to be a nuclear war? I mean, can we make it out of this? I mean, have we developed? Yeah. Can we evolve past this stuff? I feel like not. Maybe we make it out of this one, but just going to be another 20, 30 years before we have some other crazy conflict and people start drumming up war and blow each other up.
Well, yeah, there's always a risk of, an all-out nuclear war. It's not inevitable that, I think it's almost inevitable that there will be a nuclear war of some sort on some scale, let's say between Pakistan and India. But I think most likely it'll be the Israelis because they have a nuclear arsenal, and then they have this uh, well, the country is governed by um, an expansionist, apocalyptic cult, you can almost say. I mean, you can say it. I say it. And that is scary.
Backed
It's
by the
been,
United States.
right.
That's what's crazy.
Yeah. And the thing is, that if eventually they're putting their own nation at risk. But the thing is, the scary thing is that if they do go to war with Iran or whatever, and the existence of Israel is threatened, they have those nuclear weapons, and I think those people would use them. I mean, I think that we're most likely to see it if it's going to happen. And we're going to see it there. Now, that doesn't mean that that will lead to a global nuclear war or anything, but it could, and it's in any case, even if it's regional, it'll be the consequences will be horrifying.
It's crazy to think that we'll likely see a nuclear weapon being used in our lifetime. At least I think so. Just from Israel, because there's no way out for Israel at this point. I just don't think. I think that's the inevitable conclusion. We're waiting. I've been kind of on edge for the past couple of years. It's just waiting for the end, and it just this slow train wreck. It's happening. It's in motion, and I don't see any force possible out there to reverse it. Do you feel the same? I mean, with both conflicts, I just don't see any
Yeah.
way to change it.
Yeah. Well, right. I think that, well, again, there won't be a negotiated settlement in Ukraine. But I do forecast there will be a Russian victory, and it'll be an ugly one. And the problem again with the ugly Russian victory is that it will mean that this a very ultra nationalist power will remain in Ukraine and with connections to Western Europe. So there will be this continual threat of new conflicts or a spreading of the conflict into neighboring countries like Belarus and Moldova and so forth. So this is going to be a risk for years and years to come. Even if the Russians attain a clear victory, and then in Israel, right? I mean, I think again we depend on the restraint of the Iranians, really, above all. That they know what's at stake and they're very, very careful, but they're being pushed into a position where, especially if there's an all-out attack on them, where they're going to have to respond forcefully. They'll just have to, and then who knows what will happen. It is a very scary situation. I would say in the short run, the risk of some sort of conflagration is greater in Israel, like in the next couple of years, than in Ukraine. But it does exist in both places, and in the long run, Ukraine is going to be a festering sore. It just is, and there are going to be flare-ups, and there's going to be escalations, I think, for years and years to come. So anyway, we've entered these interesting times are going to persist, I think, for quite a while.
Well, they're going to persist until we cease the use of a nuclear weapon, I feel like. That's what I'm afraid of. Oh, okay. It's so crazy to even just say that, that.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I just think that's where we're at. I don't think people realize.
Yeah. Well, I can't just stop and think. Maybe some people think our rhetoric is overblown or something. But just that recent poll conducted by Penn State, 82% of Jewish Israelis want to ethnically cleanse all of Gaza, and 40, I believe it was 47%, give or take 1 percentage point, want to kill everybody in conquered territory within Gaza, which is really all of Gaza. And they have at least 200 nuclear weapons. These are the people that have 200 nuclear weapons. And they have declared the intention not only to ethnically cleanse Gaza, but to do the same in the West Bank. We forget about the West Bank, but that has, certainly the ethnic cleansing campaign there has not been abandoned, quite the reverse. Ever since October 7th, it's been in high gear.
Scary stuff, Dad. Okay, well, I think let's go ahead and end it there.
Okay.
Okay, have a good rest of your day.
You too.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.